Welcome to Women and Manufacturing, where accomplished women interview accomplished women.
Welcome, everybody, to Women in Manufacturing. I realize you were probably expecting a female voice. This is our first anniversary show of the launch of Women in Manufacturing, and Lou and I were very excited a year ago to introduce and talk to one of the original Rosie the Riveters. And this year we have such a special guest on that, I'm sorry, we just couldn't let it go. And Lou and I, for the anniversary show, wanted to talk to this incredibly special person on this first anniversary show of Women in Manufacturing. I know that I'm very excited. Lou, I know you're just wound up.
I'm jumping out of my chair.
Chair, skin, everything. Let me introduce to you Betty Reid Soskin, who has a 90-plus year story to share with us, and she also has a memoir out, Sign My Name to Freedom. Love the title of the memoir, a memoir of pioneer living. Gosh, Betty, welcome to Women in Manufacturing.
I am glad to be here. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to be anywhere.
By the way, before we get too far into it, did you not have a birthday back on September 22nd?
I had my 97th birthday last Saturday.
Unbelievable. That's terrific.
Yes.
And happy birthday.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go decade by decade, or do we want to leave out the first 10?
No, well, actually, I have
decade?
a question for Betty on those first 10 years, and you might remember when you were 2, but you
Okay.
might remember when you were 10, and part of my questioning, Betty, is because I have a love for the history of Black people in America. And I'm very sensitive to much of the pain that they've gone through. I'm curious, when you were a little girl growing up, wherever you were growing up, I know some places in the inner city, it's absolutely fearful to even walk to school. Did you have those kind of experiences when you were a youngster growing up?
Actually not. I was, my first 6 years were, of course, I was not in school. I didn't enter school until first grade. And at that point, we were already living in California. So I was out of the South. Those years, I think I pretty much spent my life growing up as a second-generation Californian, not as a Southerner. So that I escaped a lot of that pain that urban children might have been facing.
Right.
I grew up at a time in California when there really weren't enough of us on the West Coast to make any rules about. It wasn't that segregation or bigotry didn't exist. It was that there simply weren't enough of us, and so it was not graphic. It was in gentlemen's agreements. It wasn't in signs. It wasn't in practices. It wasn't in the hostile South. So I was spared some of that as a small child.
As you got older, though, and I'm kind of moving ahead three or 4 decades, when you moved to Walnut Creek, California, you experienced some of those issues.
Yes, and that was after the Second World War. We moved into the suburbs after I was grown up. I was actually pregnant with my I guess, third child. And in 1952, we moved into an area that was whites only, because unknown to most people, the GI Bill, which enabled the lives of most Americans and sort of assured them a future, the GI Bill was administered locally rather than federally, so that the local banker could determine who could get property where, who could get financing where. So it was at that point after the Second World War that the people of color could move into the places abandoned by the white population as they moved into the suburbs. Moving into the suburbs, it was enabled by their GI Bill. We had grown up, both my husband and myself had grown up in California, so that we didn't have any of those incentives of built-in prohibition that the migrant workers had, we weren't hesitant to purchase a lot in the Diablo Valley, which was outside the San Francisco Bay Area, to build our house. And we moved into an area where people had moved there in order to get away from people like us. We didn't know that. So that we lived with about 5 years of death threats. It was a rather miserable time, but that's who we were as a nation in those years. That same community, which was so hostile when we built our house, actually threatened to burn the lumber as fast as it was stacked in the building of the house. But that same community sent me to represent them as a McGovern delegate 20 years later in 1972. That's how fast social change was occurring in this country and in the area where I lived.
Well, you showed them.
I know. They showed me.
Betty, I'm just curious, back in 1939, about the time you would have turned 18,
yes,
when you were old enough to vote, it would be another 25 years, 1964, before you got the right to vote. What was it like going
No,
through
actually not.
I
voted for the first time when I was 21 because that was the age of franchise, and I guess my first vote was for Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Oh wow!
And I was already at 16 working in campaigns, working to register voters when I was 16 because I had a very enlightened white teacher when I was in 7th grade, I guess it was, 7th and 8th grades, who moved me. He was actually working as a campaign manager for a candidate for governor of California, and he brought me as a summer job into his campaign so that I could learn the process. So I was already indoctrinated long before I was voting.
Ah, okay. Okay, so I was just looking at the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is where I was coming up with my numbers.
Yeah.
Now it's interesting that you were voting before that.
That would be in the southern states. That would not have been on the California coast.
Well, now that's interesting. Well, thank you for clearing that up for me.
See how much you're going to know, Tim, when you're 97 years old?
No, I'm going to learn it now from her.
And think of how much I've had to unlearn.
So that's fabulous. So, Betty, when you were in your high school years,
yes.
I gather you became an activist of sorts. I don't even know if they used that word in those days, but you became an activist in politics. What are the areas of activism did you participate in?
I think the first time and most of this is called activism after the fact. I only can go back in retrospect and realize what I was doing was activism. At the time, it was a social thing. I remember one of the social things that I did that turned into really history-making activism was when Paul Robeson was here. He was here in the Bay Area for an event. I think it was during the just before the Second World War, where he was here as a guest of someone who was a friend of my parents. And he, as an aside, he was picketing the Paramount Theater in downtown Oakland against Walt Disney's Song of the South. And I was invited by friends to participate in that, and I marched with him in front of the theater. And I remember that we were given a lemonade party after that was over at the home of the host of Robeson's, and I played Spin the Bottle and got kissed on the cheek by Paul Robeson. That may have been my my first active act. And I think I was all of maybe 17, 18.
Well, it was interesting that you were involved in the ceremony to honor Rosie the Riveters and given the microphone and had an opportunity to speak about there were no black Rosies. Can you share a little of that with our listeners?
Yeah, well, there really were black Rosies. It's just that I didn't consider myself one of them. If you knew that I entered the national park scene, pretty much in the year 2004, 2003, maybe 4, and it was at a time when I was working as a field representative for a member of the California State Assembly, and this park rose in the area where which was my assembly district, and so the first echoes of my activism with the parks came about through that window. I was attending the planning meetings because the Department of Interior the National Park Service was gathered here to begin to shape this park, because it was one of the earliest of the urban parks, and that was at a time, I guess, in the early '60s maybe, when the National Park Service became aware of the fact that every single taxpayer was funding the creation, the development, and the maintenance of this incredible system of national parks. But it was only the people who had the financial resources and the leisure time who could afford to visit them. And for the first time, they began to see the need to develop urban parks. But there were no models for those. You know, how do you develop a national park without any federal lands in the first place? Urban parks involved a very, very different set of prescriptions. And so this park had been created in the legislation on scattered sites that lay throughout the city of Richmond. And the city of Richmond had been selected because there were more still standing structures through which to interpret that home front history than any other place in the country. But those sites were all, scattered sites were all either owned privately by civically by nonprofits. They were not connected to one another. How do you connect a national? How do you build a national park that where all the sites are disconnected from one another? There were these answers that were posed by the planners, and it was at those planning meetings when those questions were being explored by the owners of said properties and the community. And I attended those meetings as a field representative for the California State Assembly, and in so discovering, realized that in 1942, it took $47.25 a week to support a family of 5, and that was if you were white. But our fathers and our uncles, as black people, were all members of the service workers generation. They were the janitors and the cooks and the waiters and the Pullman porters and the bellhops and the laborers, and they earned $25 to $35 a week. So the women in my family had been working outside their homes since slavery. It had always taken 2 wages to support black families. So if women were being celebrated as Rosie the Riveter, because that was the first time women were introduced into the non-traditional labor force. But I didn't consider myself a Rosie because my family had been involved in labor, in traditional labor for many, many, many decades. So that I never considered myself a part of that. But when the park was being planned, it was very clear that the park was being planned around the myth or the concept of Rosie the Riveter, which was the women of World War II. And if it was expanded to tell the story of the home front, because that history was far more complex than that. It was also the story of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans who interned. It was the story of that great explosion at Port Chicago, 2 Kaiser ships that were vaporized, the loss of 320 lives, 202 of them being black dock workers. the fact that 50 of those men refused to go back and load those ships because nobody could explain what had caused the explosion. And because they disobeyed an order during wartime, they were tried in mutiny trials and found guilty. The first time in history we ever tried 50 people in single trial and found them all guilty. We sentenced them to 8 to 15 years in prison because they disobeyed an order during wartime. So there were many, many stories. The story of African Americans' migration out of the South to find jobs in defense plants, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. So it was expansion of that story to include all those aspects of the Homefront story that I was able to contribute, but not as a Rosie, but as a worker on the Homefront. And so that's the role that I assumed.
So then, not to move too fast through your decades, somewhere along the line, I think when you were 85, you became
a permanent park ranger.
Right, and still are to this day.
Because all you guys had forgotten all that good stuff.
Right, that's right. That's right. Actually, how I ran across your name in the first place, my wife was reading a magazine article, and it was a magazine article about the oldest national park ranger. And my wife said, shout to Betty Soskin. And obviously we have. And it was an amazing story. And you're still working as a park ranger.
Yes, I am.
So do you ride around on a horse or you take tour groups out?
No, I mostly do outreach for the national parks. I do 3 to 5 programs a week in our theater, dealing with the history of that time. The park has been very, very generous, very, very supportive in allowing me to share my history with the an audience that I guess, are serving now 5,000 to 7,000 visitors a month, and our programs are booked up 2 months in advance. The secret of that, though, is that our theater only holds 48 people, so I sell out. Me and Hamilton.
So somewhere along the line, I heard that you and Jackie Robinson were connected somehow.
He was a date when I was before I was married to Mel Reid. I was. I met Jackie. He was here to play from UCLA against Cal at the homecoming, which was the black homecoming. Cal and Stanford played the white homecoming. Cal and UCLA played for black homecoming, and Jackie was here for that. And yes, he was a very, very nice young man.
Oh, that's wonderful. Betty, I know that, I was reading an article that appeared in Berkeley Side that Daphne White wrote of you and interviewed you. That was back in February of this year. And you shared something that it stopped me in my tracks. And I told you as we talked pre-show, I actually had to go back and check American history to find out the facts here. And the statement was, that slavery was for a period of 300 years. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, the nation's only 245 years old. And I went, wait, I have to go back and find out when the first slaves arrived in America. And it was 1619. I was shocked.
Yes, that's true. It's an amazing story. In fact, the story of slavery in my family is fascinating. My great-grandmother, Leontine Bro Allen, was born into slavery in 1846. She was enslaved until she was 19, freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, at which time she married George Allen, who was a corporal in the Louisiana State Colored Troops fighting on the side of the North in the Civil War. And together they produced 13 children. And in their home, my mother was born to their eldest son, George, and his 14-year-old wife, who only lived until my mother was 7 months old. But my great-grandmother lived to be 102, not dying until 1948, 3 years after my experience in that Jim Crow Union Hall that I worked in during World War II. And I was 27 years old, married and a mother, when my slave ancestor died. She had raised all of the significant adults in my life. And my mother lived to be 101, born in 1894 and died in 1995. And I was born in 1921, and I'm still here. And those three lives of my great-grandmother, my mother, and four lives, my grandfather, George, and myself, combine the American narrative all the way from the Dred Scott decision to Black Lives Matter. If you can imagine that.
That's amazing.
Incredible.
That is amazing.
Isn't that amazing? And add to that the fact that on January 20th of 2009, with a picture of my great-grandmother in my breast pocket, I'm a witness to the inauguration, sitting on the Capitol Mall, witnessing the inauguration of America's first African-American president. In the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Lincoln, whose life was contemporary with the life of my great-grandmother, because that's how fast the time goes. Can you imagine?
So this is, I'm getting chills because I feel like I'm talking to history.
Can you imagine that?
No.
And I get to share that history with the audiences that come through. It's an amazing privilege.
Wow. Well, the other thing that I was staggered by as I looked from the first slaves in America to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 350 years elapsed before blacks could vote in Southern America. And at some point, as you went through that, you realized that the rage you thought had dissipated was simply buried. Where's that?
No, it was dormant. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was reawakened with Katrina, because I had arrived in California as a 6-year-old. I arrived in California as a 6-year-old because that was the year in 1927 when the city fathers in New Orleans bombed the levees in order to save the Garden District in St. Charles Avenue, and they sacrificed the 7th and 9th wards and the Treme, which was our ancestral home. And that was how we came into California. And that rage that I had been storing, I think, silently all through my childhood and adolescence really, really was only dormant, because when I watched the coverage on Katrina 10 years ago, all of it, I found myself in bed in a fetal position, as if it had all happened just yesterday. But I think that the rage has served me well. It had been there when I needed it, to keep my back straight when I needed it, because I think that anger served my life. I think now that I'm very aware that I am living in the future, that along with millions of others, I helped to create in the 60s. That I've lived into that future.
Is that 1960?
Yes, 64. Yeah, in 64, 65, all the way through the 70s. That period of activism created the country, the democracy that I'm now living in, and that to have the privilege of living into that future and understanding that I am now have the power to create the future that my grandchildren are going to live in, and that's amazing.
So, Betty, what would you comment about? This is the year of the woman,
yes,
very, very clearly, and being that you've got so many years of being a woman, what would you recommend today for the new up and coming women into this time frame that we're in? And there's all kinds of things going on in Washington and with regards to sexual harassment and so on.
Yeah.
What's your take on all of this?
I don't know
going
that
on?
I'm wise enough to know how to advise anyone about their lives and since the rate of change has been so boosted by technology that I don't know if I can even envision the world that they're going to live in another 20 years. I don't know how to do that, but I do know that there have always been people in this country who have been striving to get it right. And that it's as if that the country goes through these periods of chaos, and they've been going through them cyclically, in cycles, ever since 1776. And then we're in another one of them right now. And it's in those periods, those cycles of chaos, when democracy is being redefined, and that we have access to the reset buttons, and that it's as if we're living on an upward spiral. We keep touching the same places at higher and higher levels, and each time we touch them, we're setting the stage for the next generation. And that if it hadn't been that there were enough of us always trying to get it right, we would not be where we are. I would still be enslaved like my great-grandmother was. And that history may have been written by the people who got it wrong, but the people who got it right have prevailed. That we are still moving, that every generation has to recreate democracy in its time, or it will die. That it doesn't matter whether we explain the numbers of us voting by voter suppression or passivity, but the fact that 39% of us 4 years ago was predictive of the 40% turnout in the most recent election, an election where only 17% of us went to the polls, who were between the ages of 18 and 29. And where 61% of us over 50 did vote, so we were opting for yesterday rather than planning for tomorrow. That it's the assumption that democracy is a fixed thing, that it's not the dynamic system of governance that requires participation. That if we forget that, then we'll lose it. And if there's an advice that I could give, that it's that we have to recreate democracy, that we have to do that each in our own time, and that it's in this period of chaos that women may be defining who we will be in this next decade, and that particularly women of color are finding their voices. That is absolutely an amazing, amazing thing that I'm glad I lived to see.
Well, it seems as though that you've got a real handle on this topic, and that you have lived through many cycles of the democracy changing. I would like to ask you how you feel about where this is going to go in the next cycle. I heard you say that women generally are beginning to get their new voice and making change.
Yeah, we're finding our voices. Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, and it's not only that; it's that my work takes me into the future. In that I have done programs in Silicon Valley with Nike, with Google, with Facebook, with Salesforce, with Adobe, in audiences. The most recent audience was an audience of 1,300 people, young people from all over the world. They were part of the Adobe force. And the feeling that I had stepped into the future, and that a lot of the questions that those of us in my age range and your age range, a lot of those questions that we're still asking, those kids have all answered. That I feel so hopeful when I go into that new world that's already forming, that it is an exciting thing, that I wish I wasn't, I've given up buying green bananas now. I wish that weren't true, and I wish I could work out a Faustian bargain for another 10 years, because I think that we're on the cusp of something. If we can face the climate changes, the global warming, the rising sea levels, and I think the answers to those are within reach. If we can face that reality, that we're facing into a great future.
All we have to do is convince those who aren't convinced of the issues and the various cycles that need to be addressed and
that may
with.
be the greatest. That may be the greatest challenge in the next half decade.
Correct.
Because after that, it may be too late. Yes.
Betty, I wanted to share with you that when I was 11 years old, one of my favorite orators gave a speech at the National Mall, literally on my birthday. Not that that's why he did it, clearly. The I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin
Oh, my God.
Is
you
my
were there?
favorite. No, I was not. That's my favorite speech of all time. Of all of the speeches that people have given, it's that one that just most strikes me as beautiful and brilliant.
Yes.
What an incredible piece of work. But you were seeing it from California. And you had some very interesting experiences when you were young with the Black Panther movement. Is that right?
Yes. I was living in the suburbs when the Panthers were formed, but I became a bag lady for the Panthers. I gave events and supported events that were connected with my Unitarian church that raised money for the Panthers and would deliver them. I would drive in because I found myself in the odd position of being the only person of color in within miles in the suburbs, at a period where Black identity was being defined. I was involved nationally with the Black movement, but locally, the nearest thing to me, to my being involved in the Black movement, was the Panthers. And I would drive into the urban centers in order to picket and march with them because I was in the position of living among the people who had the power, the political power to change, to bring the social changes about that were needed in the inner cities, and that I was in a position to influence that world. And I was being asked to explain what was happening in the cities. And at first I would wonder, why are they asking me? I mean, why should I know that? I'm a suburbanite. And then I began to realize that my job as a middle-class African-American living a suburban life was to be a conduit for power, because nobody was going to give power to someone standing on the corner with his brick in his hand. But I was choking on it, and that I had to arm myself by participating in the inner cities in order to be able to connect that power by being a conduit for power. And that's what I spent the 60s and 70s being. It was a rather unique position, but I did that not only locally but nationally.
So Betty, aside from the fact that you were an activist and became middle class, and today you are a author, you're a songwriter, you are a author of a very well-selling book, and a park ranger, the oldest park ranger in the United States, maybe forever, since the National Park Service.
I'm going right. I'm going right from the park to the cemetery.
You're not going to stop at the stoplights, huh? So
no.
What is it that you do now to keep busy?
I am busier than anyone should be, even at the age half my age. And the thing is that it's where my energy comes from. I want to be all used up. I want there to be nothing left to put in that box. I plan to be active until I can no longer be. And fortunately, I'm supported in that wish and in that work by a federal agency that is seeing to it that as long as I want to be here, I can do that work. And my replacement hasn't yet shown up.
Betty, I'm curious, because you've been through so much of this, and from your eyes, seen it from a different perspective than us old white guys. I'm one of those old white guys. And we see such division in America today. Even in our national politics are awful. They can't even seem to carry on a conversation with the other side. And trying to speak to this subject, even myself personally, I find it difficult to open a conversation because the word racist is thrown around so freely and quickly. What's it going to take to heal?
I wish I were wise enough to know the answer to that. I don't really know. I do know that some of our energy comes from that debate, and it probably will always be there because I don't think that democracy is ever going to be fixed. I think it's a process that every generation has to recreate it. And in the doing, the debate is going to always be changeable. I think that some of that's good. I think that where we are now is a stuck place. I think that we're going to work our way through this because the freedom to do that exists within the system. I think that I felt elation in watching the Charlottesville Tiki Parade. Jews will not replace us. And I remember thinking if anyone knew that I was feeling elated by this, they would think I was crazy, except that what I was seeing was that many of us had been living with domestic terrorism for generations, and that it was masked, that the hoods were off finally, that there was no way for anyone to not see what we had been seeing all along, and that there was nowhere to hide anymore, that there was no way to encode the message, that maybe now, in this condensed kind of way, that it's going to be painful, maybe now we can get at it, that maybe it was hopeful. So there's an element of hope, even in this seemingly disastrous period, that we really can get at it because it can't be hidden any longer. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I went back, it may have been a year ago or so, and I looked at something that I don't know how many old white guys look at. And I looked at who were the contributors to some of the most curious and interesting inventions in America. And if you look at that history, you'll be amazed, I think, how many black people invented things that have contributed to America. And in some cases, because I now live in Atlanta, so I'm living in the old South. And I see the mailbox on the corner, and I'm thinking to myself, I wonder how many white people who chucked their mail into the mailbox realized the mailbox was invented by a black man.
Yes. My grandfather was one of those. He helped he designed and built a number of important edifices in New Orleans, and he could build nothing and put his name on it because he couldn't even be licensed or get patents under his own name. He had to do it through a white person.
Wow. I mean, the saying, the Real Mccoy, which all of us are familiar with, happens to come from an oiler that they used on locomotives that oiled the wheels so the train could... Otherwise, they had to stop the train about every 10 or 12 miles and oil all of the wheels. And a guy by the last name of McCoy came up with an automated oiler to move trains across America, another black man.
No, I didn't know that. That's great.
There's some brilliant black women involved in inventions in America. Just incredible. Someone would
Hidden Figures will give you that story.
Yes, if they would dig into this black history, they would find that it's such an important component of America today and the amalgam that we've become. And I'm sure they have no realization of the enormous contributions that have been made.
Yeah, and I think that what's happening now is that as the entertainment world is opening up. There are more and more creative directors and designers and producers who are bringing those stories to a general public, to a public that is finally ready to accept them. Mm-hmm. Those films are being shown in general theaters throughout the country, and they're not only being shown to black audiences, but to interested mixed audiences. The people marching on the streets are no longer, for human rights are no longer black as they were in the 60s, but now there are young people and old people and people from every economic class who are marching for Black Lives Matter. I mean, we are a different country, and I think that will accelerate into the next decade, and I think that's where our energy is going to come from. I wish I could stick around to see it, guys, but but I am more hopeful than most people are, I think. Having lived through those,
Yeah, the Lord said we had 5 score and 20, so you're going to go to 120. We're rooting for you, Betty.
Well, we'll have to have her back.
All right.
Yeah, that's right.
Betty, about a year and a half ago, they came out with a new movie called 13th. And it was about the 13th Amendment. And,
I haven't seen that.
Well, it's a fabulous documentary, and it was about the 13th Amendment that allowed for prisoners to be, when incarcerated, would be building and making products and services for the government, most of which were black people. From after the Civil War, and it was a different form of slavery. And we've done several shows on it, and we've had quite a few people on who have been negatively affected by the 13th Amendment, and particularly manufacturing companies who are losing contracts to the prison system.
To the prisons, right.
Yes. And they really don't train them. It's just warehousing of people. And
I know.
I would recommend that you follow up. Matter of fact, if you have Netflix, and I have a feeling you might be that.
Yes.
There it is. That's where the movie is, 13th. And
great.
I highly recommend
I will do that.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting that Lou mentions that. Kanye West recently made a remark about abolishing the 13th Amendment. I have read it. Lou and I have studied it. We know what he meant when he talked about abolishing the 13th Amendment. He talked about amending that language which allows the prison system to use prisoners, largely black, as Lou points out, as slaves. And we find it disgusting and repulsive, and it makes us angry. We've invited Kanye West onto our show to talk about it. You have lived it, Betty. I mean, this is just incredible to speak with you about the last 97 years and your family history. It's incredible.
Well, thank you. I don't think thank you is appropriate, but
well, we thank you because what you can share with America and what all African Americans can share, although slavery was truly brutal, there are portions of it that is a beautiful history of the race that really needs to be brought out, and I'm glad you're saying that the entertainment industry is doing more. They are. And I'm glad that you have 2 documentaries coming up. Can you share with our listeners kind of the when and where those will happen?
One of them is, they've both been probably in production now for the last 3 years. One of them is going to be the replacement for me, and I think in the parks when I'm no longer here. It will be one of the offerings among other films. The second one is a 90-minute documentary that is based upon my music, and it tells the story of the civil rights struggle as expressed. Because as it turned out, I was documenting the 60s and 70s and 80s in song without realizing that's what I was doing. And those tapes of that music were hauled around in boxes for years and years without discovery. I never published anything. And those songs are being published now as a soundtrack for the second film because they carry the history of the civil rights movement. So then that one's scheduled for release at the end of next year.
Okay. Well, Betty, we want to also remind our listeners that your book is out. It's on Amazon.com. I'm sure there's many other places that can get it. Sign My Name to Freedom, a memoir of a pioneering life. I absolutely love the title. We will have links to the book on our two websites, mfgtalkradio.com, which is Manufacturing Talk Radio, as well as Women and Manufacturing, our WHAM show at womenandmfg.com. We want to thank you for sharing with us these moments and your recollections and your experience in American history and even today and your vision of the future. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Betty.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
It's truly an honor. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And we'll be back in touch with Betty as she makes more American history. We're bedazzled by her and her history. And we want to remind all our listeners that this is our first anniversary show on Women in Manufacturing. And Lou and I, who introduced the show a year ago, are now bringing it back with another incredibly accomplished woman who's done some extraordinary things in her life. So again, thanks for listening today, and we'll be back again with you next week.
Thank you for listening to Women and Manufacturing.